Throughout this DVD, I have been raving about Sergei Karjakin's chess exploits and his road to Grandmaster at the age of just 12 years and 7 months. A remarkable feat, of course. But where he really hit the headlines was in 2004 in the Dortmund Sparkassen chess meeting, where he defeated the reigning world champion Vladimir Kramnik of Russia with his rating of 2770. Although it was a blitz game, so we should just mention that because in a classical game that would be a little bit different, Karjakin really hit the lines here because the way he managed to outwit his celebrated opponent in the endgame. I joined the position here on move 66 where Karjakin as white has an extra pawn on a5, but what we see here is the presence of opposite colour bishops. Now the general rule is what most people say is, well, opposite colour bishop endings are always drawn. However, with the presence of rooks on the board, that changes somewhat. So never assume that any rook and opposite colour bishop ending should just be drawn, and especially so since white is an extra pawn ahead. Still though, it takes a lot of expertise in order to actually win this position. What is white trying to do? Well, generally we want to try and queen this pawn, because if we were to win black's rook or bishop for it, white would have a serious advantage then. But if we notice that that square is covered by black's rook and the black bishop, it's going to be very difficult for white to actually put that plan into fruition. So it takes a lot of manoeuvring. Clearly, I should also just add that this was a blitz game, and it's much easier for the attacking side to play these kind of positions with short time limits, because black is the one who has to find all the defensive moves. Still though, to put away such a strong opponent like Vladimir Kramnik, you need to stick to your plan, you need to have this plan formulated, and you need to be very careful to avoid any tactics that could come about. Karjakin started with bishop d8. Now, that's an excellent move because it defends both of the pawns from there. Still though, it doesn't really help us demonstrate how we're going to queen that pawn, but this is part of the plan that white is trying to achieve in this position. So, black was reduced to moving around and just generally trying to keep control of the position. And here we see white play these attacking moves. Again, as I said, it's easier to play when you're the attacking side, the one with the advantage. Rook to a1. Rooks behind passed pawns are the general rule here. And king b4. So where would white like to place the king? Optimization of your pieces is very important, especially with reduced material like this. White would like to put the king to a7, because there it would help push the a pawn, and it would control that queening square as well, which might be quite an important factor later on. Okay, let's see how this can actually come about. So rook b1 check, and rook a1. Here comes the king to a7. Still though, it's not easily clear how white is still going to win, because whilst we can push the pawn now, and it's being defended by the rook and the king, how are we going to move the pawn even further? Because if the white king were to ever move, for example to b8, the king would not be protecting the pawn on a6. So still obstacles to overcome. And rook b6. Now I did just say that all opposite colour bishop endings are generally drawn. So now it appears that black can actually get one of those by swapping off. However, Karjakin has noticed another feature of this h-pawn, and you probably have guessed it already, which is that square on h8 is called the queening square, and it's actually dominated on a dark square, which we have. So what will happen now is white will win the bishop for the pawn for the bishop, like this, and be left with the bishop and the h-pawn. But this position is winning because of the queening square being covered by the black bishop. So Karjakin actually noticed that he was able to swap rooks in that position, and that is why Kramnik decided, well, I'm not going to allow that. And rook b5. Again, a6, we just talked about that. But if black stays put like this, it's still very difficult. You see how moves like this, it's very tricky to see how white's going to win still. So Karjakin decided, I'm just going to play rook b5 and keep the rook like this. Here goes the pawn on a6. There was a little trick here. Instead of bishop f5, if black were to play king h6, because now it appears that white has lost the control of the pawn push to a6. However, what it does allow is this trick of bishop f6, and out of nowhere, again, the black king is going to be caught in a mating net. Rook h8 is threatened, and the rook on a1 is being threatened as well. So after rook takes a5 check, king b6, we see a multitude of threats there and on h8, and there's nothing black can do about it. So Kramnik playing the best defence, of course, as you'd expect from a strong player. He played bishop f5, but now a6 and rook b6. I describe this here as exemplary technique, where you notice from many Grandmaster games, very strong players, their pieces are very harmoniously placed well together. They defend each other. Notice that white's pieces on the queen side here all defend each other. The white pieces on the king side are all defending each other. And there's very little chance that white is going to lose something or drop something. And that's something we should all take on board. This idea of harmonization or defending each other reduces the chance of you actually losing one of your pieces. Okay, still a long way to go. King b8. Now the king moves out the way for the pawn to try and charge. Let's see how black tries to prevent that. Okay, we can go a7, but I think black's idea was to go rook f8 check, and white would be forced to play king c7. How is white going to push that pawn now? Because black has that square under control. Probably this might still be winning. In fact, let's look at this, might be a draw, because after check we have to keep moving the king back to c7. So still chances for Karjakin to go wrong, but instead bishop f6, and that prevents the rook running back to f8. So very carefully, he's playing very carefully in this position to prevent any defensive ideas from Kramnik here. And now the pawn pushes one square away from touchdown. Notice at the beginning it started on a5, but even though it only takes 2 moves to go to a7, it took a lot of planning, didn't it? Bishop f3. Now, is white ready to queen? The answer is no, because of the skewer. So another trick set by Kramnik, but of course Karjakin is going to have none of that, and bishop d8. So rook a1. Unfortunately, this drops his g-pawn. And after the following moves, he played another nice move, rook b5. Can you see why he actually played it to b5 rather than anywhere else along that rank? And the point is that he now wants to intercept the bishop by playing rook to b7. We've already spoken about how this pawn and that bishop will lead to a winning endgame because of the queening square on h8. That's a very important factor. And white's plan is simply to play rook b7 and then queen, win the black rook. Let's see how that turns out. King g6, rook b7. If black takes it, king takes b7, and there's nothing that black can do about a8 queen. I mean, we can do a spite check, but maybe bishop b6 is just winning. So after rook d1, bishop b6, black actually resigned here. Just going to quickly show you how that would pan out. If after rook a1, queen, this position is a win because the white king will eventually make its way to g6, and he will push the pawn to h7. And the point is that black can never now put the king in the corner to blockade the h-pawn because of bishop d4 checkmate. So the king will be forced to run to f8, and then white can make a queen. So basically the idea is if you've got an h-pawn or rook's pawn, maybe even on the other side another rook's pawn, make sure that the queening square is of the same colour as your bishop. So excellent technique, and we see the real turning point in Karjakin's career here. He's already reached just around 2600 level, so a serious level, but beating the world champion, even in a blitz game, really showed his potential.